Well, over the last 50 years in America, it's probably impossible to talk about early childhood over these last 50 years without talking about the TV show Sesame Street. I mean, they are just it's just ingrained really in the experience of quite a few children over these last 50 years. In fact, this statistic comes from 10 years ago. But 10 years ago, it was estimated that at that point in America, 77 million people currently alive had watched the Sesame Street TV show at some point, not just as an adult, but as a child growing up. And that was 10 years ago, and it's still running. I think it's approaching 50 years next year. So that number might be pushing 100 million by now, but that's crazy to think about a TV show that has had that kind of, not just longevity for 50 years, but that kind of reach as well. So in that vein, I would imagine that quite a number of us here this morning, and I'm going to apologize right now for this being stuck in your head the rest of the day, but you've probably heard this ditty multiple times before. Go ahead and play it, Jacob.
One of these
you can
things
sing if you
is
want.
Not like the others. One of these things doesn't belong. Can you tell which thing is not like the other by the time I finish this song?
Anybody having flashbacks right now? Childhood, growing up, right? 3 or 4 things pop on the screen. You got to figure it out. Yeah. So who's heard that before? I mean, that's a pretty common song. So we're going to play one round of that this morning, and there really is a point to it, I promise. Go ahead and open your Bible to 1 Corinthians chapter 12. So I said a couple weeks ago that we had gotten to the beginning of a 3-chapter section, chapters 12, 13, and 14, where Paul, he dedicated that section to spiritual gifts. It was all about spiritual gifts. And so what I want you to do with me is, we're just going to look real briefly at chapters 12, 13, and 14, and see if you can decide which one of those chapters doesn't seem to belong with the other two. So chapter 12, it's all about the what, the why, the how of spiritual gifts. Chapter 13, if you see your heading, it's the famous love chapter. A lot about love. You get to chapter 14. Chapter 14 is about the usage regarding a couple of specific spiritual gifts, how they ought to be applied in a church setting. So if you had to guess, 12, 13, 14, which one of those chapters would you say doesn't quite seem to be like the others? And if you're not sure, the one that we're on this morning is probably a valid guess, as Ross pointed out. Chapter 13, all right, so it's about love. Well, chapter 12 is all about spiritual gifts, what they are, why God's given them. Chapter 14, again, Paul really focuses on a couple spiritual gifts. And then right in the middle of that, there's chapter 13, the famous love chapter. This might be, you could probably argue this is the most famous chapter that Paul wrote. Right, that this is the most well-known chapter by not just Christians, but even those that are not Christian as well have heard these words by Paul. And what's normally the context for hearing 1 Corinthians chapter 13? Weddings, right? For sure. If you attend a wedding performed by a pastor, I would say odds are 1 in 2 that the message is probably coming from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And it makes total sense. The words are poetic. They're lovely, they're emotional words. It just fits so naturally in the context of a wedding. And I'm not trying to argue this morning that shouldn't be the case. Please don't hear that. I think that I have no problem with those words being used quite often in weddings. But I do want to point out, as we make our way through this passage this morning, it's probably safe to say that rarely do we study this passage in the context of 1 Corinthians, right? We normally hear it in a wedding or maybe in other places, but how often do we examine those words with the understanding of, oh, Paul is in the middle of talking about spiritual gifts. I mean, I rarely study it according to that. I don't think I've ever studied it that in depth as I have these last couple weeks. And so I think what we're going to find this morning is that even though these are some very famous words that we've heard quite often, I think we might see them in a new light this morning. There might be some depth that we discover as we keep it in the context of what we've been talking about these past few weeks. There might be some things jump out at us that we haven't noticed before. So with that being said, again, 1 Corinthians 13 is the famous love chapter. The heading in your Bible probably says something like the way of love, or love is indispensable, or it might even just say love at the beginning of that chapter. And it's fitting because Paul uses a Greek word for love, the word agape. He uses that 8 times in this chapter. That specific word in the original Greek shows up 8 times. And there's about another 8 times where the word agape isn't specifically listed, but Paul is clearly referencing that word that's already been spoken earlier in the sentence. So in English, it just comes across as it, and we know the it that Paul is referring to is this agape love. So somewhere between 15 and 20 times in this chapter, 13 verses, Paul is specifically speaking directly about agape love. So what do we mean by that? When we say agape love, what does that mean? In our English language, we have a single word, love, that really carries with it an extreme amount of variance, in its meaning, in its usage. In the Greek language, it was more specific. There were actually 4 specific words used to denote different kinds of love. And so this week, as I was studying, I came across, I think this is just a wonderful explanation. It's out of the Preacher's Outline and Sermon Bible. And I just want to read it to you because I think it just so clearly describes these 4 different Greek words. So number 1, there is passionate love, or eros love. This is the physical love between sexes, the patriotic love of a person for his nation, the ambition of a person for power, wealth, or fame. Briefly stated, eros love is the base love of a man that arises from his own inner passion. Sometimes eros love is focused upon good, other times it is focused upon bad. It should be noted that eros love is never used in the Old Testament. Number 2, there is an affectionate love, or storge love. This is the kind of love that exists between parent and child, between loyal citizens and a trustworthy ruler. Storge love is also not used in the New Testament. Number 3, there is an endearing love, a love that cherishes. This is phileo love. The love of a husband and wife for each other, of a brother for a brother, of a friend for the dearest of friends. It is love that cherishes, that holds someone or something ever so dear to one's heart. And then number 4, there is selfless and sacrificial love, or agape love. Agape love is the love of the mind, of the reason, of the will. It is love that goes so far that it loves a person even if he does not deserve to be loved. It goes so far that it actually loves the person who is utterly unworthy of being loved. So I just think that's a great description of those 4 Greek words. If I had to briefly summarize those different kinds of love, I would say it this way. Eros love is mostly about my own passions, my own desires. Storge love and phileo love, they both contain a fairly equal balance between 2 parties. There's a reciprocation between those parties. And then agape love is selfless in nature. It focuses primarily on the other person. So even more simple than that, eros love is take. Storge, phileo, it's give and take. And then agape love is give. And what we're focusing on this morning in 1 Corinthians 13, every time every time we see the word love, what Paul wrote is agape love. That's the only love that he has mentioned in this chapter. So it's this selfless love. It's this love that gives. It's love that loves another regardless of their merit or worthiness. So we've got that foundation set. When we see love in this chapter written, we know that's what Paul is talking about. And again, we got to remember, the last 2 weeks we've been looking at chapter 12, where Paul has focused on spiritual gifts. And we're going to continue next week in chapter 14, where Paul continues talking about spiritual gifts, a few specific ones. And so to be totally honest, the game that we played at the beginning, it seems like chapter 13 is not like the others. It is out of place. What are you doing, Paul? Your spiritual gifts, now we're going to go down this rabbit trail, talk about love, and then come back. It just seems like Paul is kind of jumping all over the place here. But again, as we examine this chapter on love in the context of what Paul's writing, we're gonna see some rich truths this morning. So let's look together at the first verses of chapter 13. Paul writes in verse 1, and he says, "If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor, give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing." And again, we remember the context for this passage. The church in Corinth at that time, they have been experiencing these wonderful gifts of the Spirit that have been poured out on them. They were new, right? They were new believers. This was a new thing that they were experiencing, and some of these gifts were quite extraordinary in nature. I mean, some of the believers were performing unexplainable miracles. Some of the believers were giving words of prophecy directly from God himself. Some of the believers were speaking in the language or understanding a language which they've never studied before. There's no way to explain how they could understand or speak those languages. And so not surprisingly, some of those kind of more out of the ordinary gifts of the Spirit were being exalted in the church. They were being envied by some in the church. Those who had them were being tempted to think of themselves as superior because they had those gifts. Some who didn't have those gifts were tempted to think of themselves as inferior because they didn't have these gifts that kind of brought with it the marvel and the wonder that maybe some of the others didn't have quite as naturally. And so this is why Paul, in the previous section, in chapter 12, he spent all that time talking about the parts of the human body and how they are all necessary, how they are all important for the function of the body. So, even though many in the church in Corinth would have desired these gifts that were kind of more supernatural on first appearance, the church would not have been better off if everybody had those gifts. I mean, that's the point Paul was making. All of the gifts are needed for the function of the body. And so Paul urged them to view those gifts as they should, to view their personal gifts as they should, to utilize them in the church body. And what Paul goes on to say in these first 3 verses is, it doesn't matter what spiritual gift a person has. If the gift is not accompanied by love, then it has no value. If the gift is not bathed in love, then it has no value. And as Paul makes that point, really he specifically points out these specific gifts that were being envied in the church. So you look at verse 1. Paul says, if a person speaks in tongues but they don't have love, then it's the equivalent of a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. I was quite tempted to locate a pair of marching band cymbals this morning and have somebody just play them while I'm talking, just so we can experience, what that is like. I don't even think I need to, because we can already picture how, I don't want to use the word annoying, but it almost, when it's overbearing like that and it's just out of place, that's the word, right? Paul's saying it, you could speak in the tongue of men or of angels, but if you don't have love, you're just that gong going off that's driving everybody nuts. And Paul says then in verse 2, right, if a person has the gift of prophecy or of knowledge or of faith, but has not love, they're nothing. I mean, gifts of prophecy are wonderful things. They can greatly impact a person's life. Knowledge of God is something that mankind has been striving for since the beginning of time. Faith that can move mountains is an incredible display of God's power. But Paul says all of those spiritual gifts without love mean nothing. They mean nothing. And then verse 3, he goes on, a person could give sacrificially to the poor. A person could give their body over to suffering, but if they have not love, then they gain nothing. I mean, Paul's saying it doesn't matter how much of your possessions you give away. It doesn't matter how much of yourself you give away. Without love, it's all for nothing. So I guess in other words, verse 1 says, it doesn't matter what you and I say. Verse 2 says, it doesn't matter what you and I believe. And verse 3 says, it doesn't matter what you and I do. If we don't have love, if those things are not all bathed in love, this agape love, then it's all for nothing. It's all for nothing. And we've already talked about, right? There's variety in the gifts given by God, and there's variety in those gifts being administered through God's people. This command that Paul is giving here is all-inclusive. It applies to each and every person, no matter what our spiritual gifts are, no matter what combination of spiritual gifts we may have. It applies to all of us. Without love, it's all nothing. It's all nothing. And so as Paul starts here, okay, so we need to have love with our spiritual gifts. It might seem like, well, I just need to add a little bit of love to my spiritual gifts and we'll be good to go. But Paul goes on to give really an incredible description of just what agape love is. And I don't envy Paul here. Like, how do you describe that? All right, and Paul's going to say, I want to tell you what kind of love it is I'm talking about here. Man, I'm not envious of the task that Paul has. I mean, how do you adequately and succinctly describe something that seemingly expresses itself in so many different ways? You know, a Webster's definition is just not going to cut it here, right? And it kind of reminds me of discussions that our Supreme Court has been having for decades, right? Not current discussions that have been in the news forever, but for decades. Many times you'll hear somebody say, well, this is America, and I have the freedom of speech, so I can say whatever I want. That's my First Amendment right. And the First Amendment does grant us, as Americans, freedom of speech, but you and I don't have total and complete freedom of speech. So if you and I participate in libel or slander or fraud, we can be taken to court and sued for those things and lose because of those things, even though that's speech, right? We can be taken to court for that. False or deceptive advertising is illegal in our country. A company cannot say whatever they want and advertise it and put it off as truth. All right, that's not freedom of speech. Speech that creates a clear and present danger of imminent lawless action is not protected by the First Amendment. And then finally, obscene speech, it includes certain adult and sexual images and words. Those things are not protected by the First Amendment. And so a problem that the Supreme Court has had over the decades is nailing down just what exactly is obscene speech. What exactly is not obscene speech? This debate has been going on for a long time. There's enough ambiguity in that term that someone's own personal perception can drive their stance on that topic. And the reason I bring all this up is because there's a famous statement made in 1964, Justice Potter Stewart, he famously said that when it comes to obscene images, he famously said, I know it when I see it. So he's taking, this vague concept of what does it mean, obscene? He says, when I see it, I know it. Like I know what it looks like. And so this morning, I think this is the angle that Paul is taking in this task, where he's going to describe agape love to us. How do you nail down exactly what is agape love? And Jim read for us, God is love. So in essence, we're trying to describe God. Paul is trying to describe God. And I think what he does, instead of giving us this Webster's definition, he paints a picture. He paints a picture so that we know it when we see it. And it really is an incredible picture that he paints for us. So what does it look like? What is this agape love? Verse 4, Paul says, love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. So just in those 4 verses, he gives us 15 specific pictures of agape love. 15 times where we can kind of look at it and know it when we see it. And so we're gonna work our way through these, and let's not forget the context of all this, right? Paul is writing all of this in his conversation about spiritual gifts, about those spiritual gifts being utilized in the church body. So the first picture Paul paints there, he says, agape love is patient. And another way to describe that is long-suffering. So it's not just a picture of patience where, somebody's kind of whistling with a smile on their face while they wait for the bus to show up. Like that. That's not the patience Paul's talking about here. When Paul says love is patient, this is a much more intense picture of a person basically bearing suffering and wrong treatment, especially in a situation where they might be innocent. Right? That when Paul says love is patient, that's the kind of picture that he's painting there. It's someone that they place more importance on the person performing the wrong than on the wrong that is being done to them, if that makes sense. Paul says agape love is patient. And that's just number 1 for how deep and how high that sets the bar, right? So the next one, Paul says, agape love is kind. And I think this is kind of meant to stand in direct contrast to the picture painted by patient there first. Love is patient towards those who wrong us. Patience is presented as a reaction. I think when Paul says that agape love is kind, he's more talking about an initial action toward others. It's not treating someone wrongly, not bringing suffering upon them. It's that action, and as opposed to the reaction that patience would be. Number 3, agape love does not envy, has no feelings of jealousy toward others. It doesn't downplay the successes of others. And can you see, again, thinking about spiritual gifts, can you see why Paul would bring this up, right? In a context where the church body was struggling with spiritual gift envy. Man, look at the gift. Look at that person's gift. Look at what they can do. Paul says, no, agape love does not envy. It does not envy. He says agape love does not boast. It doesn't seek applause from others. Instead, it applauds others. Right? It speaks to those in the church who would have possibly felt superior because of their spiritual gifts. Paul would say, no, the agape love that you've got to have present, that doesn't boast. And then along the same lines, he says agape love is not proud. It doesn't look down on others. Rather it's humble in nature, seeks to serve others. Man, our culture can often present pride as something to be applauded, right? Or at least, at the very least, that pride is a good thing. Our culture can present it that way. And Paul goes against that belief. He says agape love is not proud. It is not proud. He says agape love does not dishonor others. It instead seeks to treat others with honor, with respect. And remember that article that we read about the different kinds of love. Agape love, it gives of itself regardless of whether or not the other person, in our own opinion, deserves to be shown honor or respect. So agape love does not dishonor others. It's not self-seeking. And this goes against every desire of our sinful nature. Now, our sinful nature seeks to be gratified above all else. And Paul says agape love, it's not self-seeking. And so in regard to spiritual gifts, agape love sees spiritual gifts not as something through which I get things, but spiritual gifts are something through which I give things, through which I serve others and benefit others. Perhaps the best statement in this regard came from Jesus himself. He said in Mark 10, "The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve." And that's what Paul's referencing here. Agape love is not self-seeking. That's what Jesus was referencing when he spoke those words. Number 8, agape love is not easily angered, or another way to say it maybe is not quickly aroused in anger. Now, it doesn't mean that there's no anger in agape love. There are definitely times and situations where agape love will lead to anger. It will. Agape love will be rightly angered when a person is abused or when a person is oppressed. Agape love will be rightly angered when God's character is slandered. But it will not be quickly aroused by something that does not warrant that kind of response. So it's not just that there's no anger in agape love, it's that it's not easily angered. It's only angered for the right reasons. Number 9, agape love keeps no record of wrongs. And again, like with anger, it doesn't mean that it doesn't deny that wrongs have taken place, just that it doesn't keep a record of wrongs. Agape love seeks to forgive. Agape love seeks to move on. I think it's the kind of love that God displays in Psalm 103 when he says, as far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. It's that kind of love. God doesn't deny that our transgressions exist, but he's forgiven them. He's sent them far away from us. It's that kind of love. And so as we seek to utilize our spiritual gifts in our church body, as we live in community together, we're going to wrong one another. It's going to happen. I mean, we're sinful human beings. I'm not trying to excuse it. I'm not trying to say that it's all right, but it happens. And what Paul says is agape love forgives. Agape love doesn't hold those wrongs over somebody else. Doesn't seek to leverage those things. It sends them away. Sends them away. Number 10, agape love does not delight in evil. It finds no joy in the evil seen in the world. It doesn't seek to benefit from the evil that is in this world. It does not seek to exploit those who are oppressed. That's not agape love. Rather, Paul goes on, he says, agape love rejoices with the truth. It doesn't delight in evil. Instead, it rejoices with the truth. It always seeks that truth will prevail. It always fights for justice, fights for compassion. That's agape love. We got 4 more. Hang in there. This is quite, man, can you just kind of feel the bar getting raised higher and higher and higher? Agape love, number 12. Agape love always protects. I think this is a cool picture. The Greek word there, protects, it literally means roof. You can almost say agape love roofs. Roofs, I don't know what the word would be, but it's the picture of a roof that it's painting there. A roof provides safety. It provides shelter, protection, rest. Paul says that agape love seeks to do that for others. It provides safety for others, provides protection, rest for others, especially those who are in desperate need of those things. Agape love provides that. 13, agape love always trusts, and not in a gullible way that leads to oppression or manipulation, but in a way that searches for the best in a person. The English Standard Version translate it, says love believes all things. I think that's a good way to think about it. And again, not in a gullible way, but in a way that understands that we serve a powerful God, and that powerful God is able to do great and mighty things in a person's life. And so love always trusts that a miracle from God can happen, that he can powerfully work in somebody's life. Love always trusts that. 14, agape love always hopes. And this kind of ties in, I think, with trusting. You know, it looks forward to this ultimate victory which can be gained in Christ. It knows that no one is too far removed from the saving grace of God. It always hopes that will break into somebody's life. And then finally, agape love perseveres. And that Greek word, it's actually it's a military word. It talks about standing up under attack when something comes your way. So agape love quite literally looks at the struggle, looks at what lies in front of it, and chooses to stand strong in the midst of it. Perseveres. When things get increasingly difficult, agape love perseveres through it. So that's quite the picture, right? That is quite the picture that Paul gives to us. And I know when I read those verses, I can't help but say, man, I fall short on pretty much every single one of those. Paul, if that's the picture that you're painting, man, that's not quite describing my life. Not as I would like it to anyway. If these verses are the picture of agape love, then there's far too many times that what I display in my life is not that. And if you and I put our minds to it and we try and work really hard and with all of our might consistently live out this kind of love in our lives, I'm afraid it's just a matter of time before we realize we can't. It just is not possible. The picture that Paul paints here cannot be attained by you and I. We cannot work ourselves into that. I mean, we already heard Jim read from 1 John 4 that God is love. I mean, Paul is painting a picture of God for us here. Actually, some people would say if you take the word love in this chapter and substitute the name Jesus every time you see the word love, you're not going to say one false statement, that it will still all be true. And I agree with that. You can put the name of Jesus in there, and it fits totally. So how can we ever attain that? When Paul says, we need to have love, that needs to be the foundation. It needs to be what bathes the spiritual gifts. How can we do that? I mean, isn't Paul setting the bar so absolutely high that we can just never reach it? And he is. He is. The bar is so high, we will never reach it on our own. We will never consistently display this love, but it can exist in our lives. This love can exist in our lives, but it only exists when we are filled by it from the outside. It can't come from us. We can't produce it or manufacture it ourselves. It has to come from the outside. We have to be filled by another source of that love. I mean, what I think is cool is, again, this all takes place in Paul's description about spiritual gifts. Those gifts are given to us by God. They're empowered by God. They're utilized by God for His glory. So apart from God, spiritual gifts do not exist. Right? Those things only happen within us because of what God is doing. And I think the exact same thing is true for agape love. Apart from God, what He's doing in our lives, agape love does not exist. It does not exist. It's only as God fills us with His love that it then overflows from us, comes out from us. So it's not a matter of my hard work. It's not a matter of my dedication. It's a matter of my receiving. It's a matter of my allowing that love to fill me. The more I dwell on God's love and worship Him for His love and open myself to His love, that's when I'll find that love flowing through me more and more. It seems that, the church in Corinth, it seems that those there were most concerned about which spiritual gifts were flowing out through them. And, the focus was, oh man, do I have the gift of tongues flowing through me? Do I have the gift of prophecy, the gift of healing? What Paul's striving to communicate here is even more important than that is God's love flowing through me? That ought to be the question that the church there, that we are asking as well. Is God's love that foundation? Placing that above spiritual gifts. Love is absolutely necessary for the utilization of those gifts. But Paul, even more than that, Paul goes on to talk about how love's going to outlast all the rest of it anyway. So look at verse 8. Paul says, "Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, we prophesy in part, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror, then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love." So what Paul is telling us here, spiritual gifts are given to the church for the present time. There's going to come a time upon the return of Christ and his eternal reign upon the new earth when spiritual gifts, and at the very least, the ones that Paul mentions, will be unnecessary. And in fact, what Paul says is that they will cease. They will be stilled. They will pass away. But love, on the other hand, what Paul's pointing out is that love is permanent. Love on the new earth, even when spiritual gifts are obsolete, love will remain. Love will remain. And so to kind of spend time being envious of somebody else's spiritual gifts or feeling inferior because of somebody else's spiritual gifts, becoming prideful over our own spiritual gifts, Paul's saying that's all focusing on something that's going to fade away. It's all going to fade away. But to allow ourselves to be filled by God's love and then pour out that love to those around us, that is going to endure throughout all eternity. That will never fade away. So really to overly focus on temporary spiritual gifts, according to Paul, is to behave like a child. It's to see imperfectly. It's to know in part. But Paul says to focus on God's enduring love overflowing from us. According to Paul, that's to behave like a man, like a mature adult. That is to see perfectly face to face. That is to know fully. And so I want to be careful this morning that I don't overly downplay the importance of spiritual gifts. I mean, Paul spent all chapter 12, and he's gonna talk more in chapter 14 about the importance of spiritual gifts, about their utilization in the church body. So we shouldn't hear Paul or myself this morning lowering the importance of spiritual gifts. If anything, I think what Paul does is he takes love and he raises it above. He says agape love is above spiritual gifts. It is what those gifts must be bathed in. So God's love overflowing from us ought to impact every interaction that we have with people. But when it comes to spiritual gifts, especially, that ought to be true. That love is that foundation that's there with whatever our spiritual gifts are. So you think about how wonderful spiritual gifts are, and you think about how incredible those gifts are when they're utilized. God's love is even more so than that. There's a good reason that we sing more about God's love than we do about his spiritual gifts. And it's not that spiritual gifts aren't a blessing and that they aren't wonderful, they are. But the love of God is just so far above that. And that's what Paul is trying to put in perspective this morning. And what he says at the very end of chapter 12 He says, I will show you the most excellent way. Paul says God's love is the most excellent way. And he says at the beginning of chapter 14, he says we ought to be following in that way of love. You know, he said, whatever we say, whatever we believe, whatever we do, it's nothing. It's all as nothing without love. And again, we've said it. I, as a sinful human being, I cannot create that love. Can't manufacture that love. I can't earn the love. I can't attain that love. The only option I have is to be filled by that love. That really is the only option. And it's when I'm filled with that love that it starts to overflow, that it pours out, that it does impact not just my spiritual gifts, but every interaction that I have through every moment of my life. We didn't get to this last verse it's not the last verse of 1 John chapter 4, but 1 John chapter 4:19 says, we love because he first loved us. That's what we have to hold on to. It's not the earning, the attaining, the producing. It's the God loving us first, God filling us. We love because he first loved us. Would you stand with me and let's close this morning by thanking God for this love, worshiping him for this love, but also praying that he would just continue to pour that into our lives. Heavenly Father, first off, I thank you that last verse that I read is true, that you first loved us. May we never forget that it all starts there. God, I thank you for this reminder that Paul gave to us this morning, this picture that he painted for us, that we would be able to know this love when we see it. And so, God, my prayer for myself foremost, and for all of us here as well, is that you would just continue to fill me with this love. God, that I wouldn't look at that list and see it as a checklist of things that I need to do better, but would instead look at that list and really see it as how you treat me. And then, God, as I am filled by that, my prayer for me and for all of us is that it would overflow from us. God, that this love would be so evident in our lives as is written in your word, that they'll know we are Christians. They will know we are followers of you because of our love. And it's not our love, God, but it's your love flowing through us. So, God, would you do that in us? Would you continually remind us that we can't strive for this love, and continually remind us that we need to be filled by it? God, as we close this morning, just focusing on you, worshiping you again through song. May you keep that in the forefront of our minds. God, may we never forget just how much you loved us, how that impacts our life right now, and what that's going to mean for us for all eternity. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.